Your voice.
Your questions.
Your morning radio with Clement Manyathela.
This is 702.
25 minutes now before 11 o'clock. So a couple of weeks ago, we started a series looking at multilateral institutions. And today we're going to be focusing on a continental multilateral institution known as the African Union. And over the past week, we've taken you on this journey through the world of multilateral institutions. These are powerful bodies that shape economies, that influence global health. They steer international cooperation, and we've explored a number of them so far. We spoke about the World Bank. We've explored the World Health Organization, the World Trade Organization, the United Nations, and we've just been unpacking how these institutions function and why they matter, especially today in this changing geopolitical environment. So today we're turning our focus closer to home, to an institution that is born out of Africa's own aspirations for unity, progress, and collective strength. But how far away are we really from these ideals and goals? We've got Sanusha Naidoo, who is a senior research associate with the Institute for Global Dialogue, who's going to guide us through this conversation. And I'd like to hear from you as well. If you've got reflections on the African Union or you've got questions, 011-883-0702 is the number to dial. You can send WhatsApps as well on 072-702-1702. Sanusha, thank you for joining us. Good morning.
Good morning, Clement, and thank you for the invitation. Always a pleasure to be on the show.
Let's start at the beginning with understanding why the African Union was created also to replace the Organization of African Unity. What was that transition about?
Well, I think if you look back to that shift from the OAU to the AU was really around to also reflect the realities in terms of how the OAU was created in terms of a particular historical epoch, in terms of understanding where the world was in the 1960s when most African countries were gaining independence, how that then transitioned in terms of where we were in 2001. But it was also around the idea that there were structural changes in the continent to reflect the kind of political, economic, and social conditions. To try and perhaps to use a phrase, to hopefully upgrade the OAU from where it was in its inception to where it should be in its evolution. So this is where it comes to, from the OAU to the AU. And also remembering that the world had undergone significant changes in the period from 1992 to 1999. And the idea was that the AU would kind of reflect a kind of future and a kind of trajectory and evolution of Africa's architecture going forward, and maintain that level of relationships with regard to regional economic communities like your Southern African Development Community, your ECOWAS, your EAC, COMESA, and of course the Arab Maghreb Union, etc., to create that kind of building blocks around integration. So integration was key, and it also looked to how it would use particular frameworks, whether it was the Abuja Treaty and then of course subsequently Agenda 2063, to also kind of dovetail with the kind of integrative model you wanted at the economic level in terms of mainly harmonizing the context of the AU from a kind of not just a political, but also embedding a lot of socio-economic and peace and stability architecture in where you want to drive the AU and the continent in particular, where the AU is the driver towards that space.
Mm-hmm. How is it structured, though, the African Union, and who actually makes its decisions?
It's a very complex body. And like all interstate bodies, because that's what it is, right? It's like you have states that actually make up the vortex of the AU. So at the head of the AU, the way it's structured is that you have, every year you will have a member country chairing the AU. and that is on a kind of rotational basis. So that country that comes in will chair for a year, and then of course the next incoming country will do that. So on that basis, you've got this kind of membership rotation that happens at the country level. Then of course you have the Office of the African Union Commission. Now that's an important office. It's almost, I wouldn't want to say it's like a Secretary General like you see in the UN, but most of these continental multilateral bodies kind of structure themselves in a loose way, in a confederated way, like the UN does. And they have to pay their dues, and of course some of the countries are not paying the dues, etc. So there's another financial debate to happen, also part of this transition from OAU to AU. Then of course that office has a commissioner, and who heads that commission. And that office is kind of very, very, very important in the sense of it sets the direction. It acts as an intermediate between member states. It serves as the kind of secretariat to the AU. And then, of course, you have the Pan-African Parliament, which is then taken from all of the national parliaments across the continent. But there's an interesting dynamic, because the Pan-African Parliament, which you know, Clement, sits in Midrand here in South Africa. And what's interesting is that there's also a rotational basis of who heads the Pan-African Parliament from a chairing perspective. And I'm not sure if you remember, I think it was about 2 years ago, there was a whole scuffle at the Midrand PAP, at the where they were fighting over which regional bloc was actually kind of undermining it, and there was this whole dynamic of leveraging votes and buying votes, and I'm not sure if it was there where somebody actually hijacked the ballot box. And it was fascinating because, again, you got that rotational thing. And then, of course, you have all of your commissions. So you have your Peace and Security Commission, you have your Trade and Commission, you have your Infrastructure Commission, and then you have commissioners of these various commissions, which are then supposed to play a critical role in advancing the kind of intercontinental development program. Not forgetting that NEPAD, the new African Partnership for Development, is now called Order NEPAD, which is the African Union Development Agency. And that was also very interesting when its inception came out. There were competing blocks as well around that. And then you also then have linked to this is and I think it plays more of a voluntary. It's more of a voluntary role is the African peer review mechanism. Notwithstanding that, so that's the structure. But what's interesting is that the structure is housed in Ethiopia. So you have two AU conferences a year. One is the kind of the static one that happens every year in Ethiopia, in around end of January, beginning of February, or middle of February. And then in June, July, you have the rotational presidency of who's the incoming president. And then, of course, you have that country hosting the summit. And then, of course, you have the kind of discussions happen there. So in a nutshell, from a technical institutional level, it's very layered, it's very bureaucratic. And of course, you got to nominate commissioners to head these various commissions, and it's a very competitive process. I think South Africa's commissioner, who was part of DTIC, Lerato Matobogo, she's now heading one of the key institutions there, which is, I think, the infrastructure one. But it's a competitive thing. Which country puts in a candidate? Who gets that, especially the peace and security, especially the trade. It's very competitive. And then linked to that is your UN agencies, like your UN Agency for Economic Development. And then if you got the AU, the UN offers to the AU, then you have UNIDO, you can have it at a country level. So it's very interesting. But I think the real nuts and bolts of this is really in terms of what is the kind of power does the AU have in terms of whether its decision making is binding on member states.
Yeah, and we'll get to some of the successes of the African Union when we look at the decisions made. But from what you've observed, Sanusha, is the AU still relevant for the continent? Because we live in a continent that still faces a number of challenges, whether it's hunger, poverty, the politics of exclusivity, xenophobia has been an issue before, the effects of climate change, and many others. So is the AU still relevant in addressing the various challenges confronting the continent? Because it's over 60 years now. We also have Agenda or Vision 2063. And I often wonder, given where we find ourselves, is that a pipe dream or is it really a genuine concrete plan for a better Africa?
I'm being facetious here now, Clement. The question I always have about Agenda 2063 or Vision 2063 is how many of us are going to be alive at that point to see its fruition. But I think the point you're raising about is the AU still relevant or is it still fit for purpose is really a bigger existential question of all multilateral institutions, whether it's in the continent or whether it is outside of Africa, or we're talking about the bigger, broader global architecture of governance. And we're seeing the same questions being asked around the credibility of the UN. And particularly the credibility of institutions where in this current kind of global architecture, which can be described as a complex turbulence, you don't know, how much does this actually have traction? How do you bring in traction in terms of saying to member states, you've got to abide by these decisions? And I think this is where the real kind of issue or the real kind of despair comes, because for the AU, like any other multilateral body, including those regional bodies as well, the challenge that these institutions have is the question of state sovereignty. That the members, the members of the AU are actually members that hold that assert their state of sovereignty and their interest. And so if they don't want to take up the issue, or if they become more complacent and take the issue in a much more superficial way or in a cosmetic way, it's not going to create real wins. So I think where we see some of those wins that come out of the AU is when our own Nkosi Dlamini Zuma was the AU Commission chair. It caused a lot of controversy because one of the implicit kind of agreements, which is not on paper, but it's kind of a gentleman's agreement, that the 5 big countries of the African Union, South Africa, Egypt, Nigeria, Kenya, and I'm forgetting one other, they don't necessarily put candidates out for the AU Commission chair position. But unfortunately, South Africa did that under Jacob Zuma's presidency, and there was a whole lot of questions as to why that happened. But that also caused this kind of tension. But one of the good things that came out of it, and some countries will disagree, some analysts will agree or disagree, is that she did bring out Agenda 2063, but she did that because there was no kind of talking about how do we get to the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. We kept hearing about economic integration and other forms of regional integration. And so there was no kind of pushing the needle on that. So through this, she managed to then get the discussion going, push the kind of traction around the ACFTA. And we see the ACFTA being adopted with countries all depositing and domesticating instruments around the ACFTA. The ACFTA has a long way to go, but nevertheless, it got that going. But I think the challenge is when member states see their sovereignty being threatened and they don't want to take action. One of the key things was when Rwanda under Paul Kagame was heading up the AU, he came up with the reform program of how do you actually reform the AU, but more importantly in terms of financial contribution and how this will happen. That has basically been in a kind of standstill for the moment, because countries are not also thinking about how do they contribute to their own AU and get their agency, because I think a lot of the external funding which is now drying up is going to create it has created challenges, because ODA is drying up, overseas development assistance is drying up from your external partners like the EU. But the challenge is that you've got to fund your own institution, and if you're not funding it, then you are basically relying on external partners, and therefore your sovereignty gets compromised and your interest is not your interest. One final point is the Thabo Mbeki panel on illicit financial flows, which also sits within the context of the AU. I think if you look at that panel and you look at the reports that have come out in terms of how much of money illicitly leaves the continent, over about $100 billion a year, that could be used very, very systematically and in a very critical way to fund your institutions in the continent, as well as to not be burdened by debt.
Are there any missed opportunities here, Sanusha, especially now in this changing geopolitical environment? How can the AU position itself so that it can leverage from the advantages it has? I mean, we are over 1.5 billion people here. We account for roughly 18% of the world's population. This is the world's second most populous continent. And what's even more interesting is that it's characterized by the youngest medium age globally.
Yeah.
So there are opportunities here for us to be a stronger collective voice. But have we missed out on those opportunities? Because I don't think the African Union is taken seriously, even externally. I mean, I don't think we take it seriously ourselves here on the continent.
You know, what's interesting, Clement, is the fact that if we circle back to the question of the financial architecture of the AU, I think when you have a situation where your peace and security budget is externally financed, over 2/3 of it is financed by the EU, you're not actually bringing your agency and making your agency front and center. You're not leveraging your agency, and that's a challenge. The missed opportunities, I think, is to try and understand that you have to fund yourself. You have to be resource independent, and you also have to start talking about what it is that is extracted from Africa, and then basically Africa becomes a dependent continent on external goods and services and finished products. One of the things that I think it's been a slow burn, I would say, and it's been a painful one at that, because very often when you see the political issues around where countries have actually completely eroded the dynamics or the architecture of democratic processes, and that is not being taken on by the AU. I think that is where this young generation, the youngest age median of young people that are sitting in the continent, are becoming frustrated. So you saw what happened in Kenya last year. You saw what happened in Tanzania. You're seeing these prolific impacts of the Gen Z rising and saying, old people, your time is no longer. And this is what is very interesting, because they are frustrated not by the fact that, it's about that they're not getting what they want. They're frustrated because the system continues to perpetuate this kind of geriatric politics in the continent. And that in itself means that you're not listening to young people to say, we want our voice to be heard, but you are mortgaging our future, and you're burdening us with taxes and debt repayments and interest repayments, which is not our doing. So I think what is very critical is that the missed opportunity is if the AU is not listening, particularly those leaders sitting, the 54 members, and I think Morocco has become a member now. So the 54 members that are sitting in the African Union in Addis Ababa, and they're not listening to young people, because that is the real pivot where you're going to find it very difficult to keep sustaining yourself through means of suppression and trying to push these individuals to the breaking point. And I think that's what's going to happen. So we have elections in the continent where, for example, these elections are becoming more and more dangerous and perilous because they're not representing what people want. So I think that the biggest challenge that the AU faces now is how to sort out its finances, to become independent, but to have inclusion of young voices, because that's where they are failing to understand that young people are not going to be as complacent as their parents.
Yeah, and I wonder how we fare in comparison to our peers in developing countries. I mean, take what was that again? The Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or you take the Organization of American States. You can add the Arab League there as well. How do we fare?
Yeah.
And are there specific successes on the continent that you think can be attributed to this organization? Because what comes to mind, probably two things. It's the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. One thing that comes to mind. There are many opportunities offered by this in order to promote intra-Africa trade. And another success that comes to mind is, remember that negotiation in South Africa that was organized by the AU? It resulted in a peace deal between the Ethiopian government and the Tigray People's Liberation Front. But beyond that, are there specific things we can point to and say, look, this is the reason of the AU. That's why this body is so important?
Well, I just want to make a small point about comparing to ASEAN or comparing to the Arab Maghreb Union. ASEAN is more an economic political bloc, and it's very small, but what it did very well was to manage the big countries like China, and how they managed China to not become a dominant actor in ASEAN. So ASEAN still maintains that level of independence. I think you've got to be careful of how do you compare the AU, which is much larger, much bigger, to institutions. What I think with the Arab Maghreb Union, there's always been differing opinion about its effectiveness and its efficacy. I think where the AU could do very well, it has one of the things that it can use very successfully, because civil society is quite front and center here. But one of the things that they need to push forward on is the People's Court in Banjul. And the People's Court is really around it's about human rights and people's rights. And those are key areas in order for the AU to think about how does that court not to predicate it on the ICC or the ICJ, but to predicate it on the idea that how does it resolve problems? How does it resolve economic issues? How does it resolve political disputes? Not basically going outside of the continent, because now we're beginning to see how compromised the ICC is, where we're hearing about the US sanctioning key members of the ICC, and they can't basically, use their credit cards and so forth. But what I think is that you should start to strengthen that institution there. One of the saddest things that happened in Southern Africa was the whole kind of de-escalation or the destabilization of the SADC tribunal, because it was about a political gain. And I think these are institutions that need to be resurrected, but resurrected in a manner that says this is about the people's rights and this thing. So I think that is where it becomes critical for the AU. But as long as the AU still remains state-centric, we're going to keep having these challenges. But I think at some point there's going to be a tipping point on the AU, because again, the AU is modeled around the EU, it's modeled around the UN, and these institutions are beginning to show vulnerabilities.
Yeah, Sanusha Naidoo, you've been great. Thank you so much for joining us for this chat. She's a research associate fellow there with the Institute for Global Dialogues.